first and foremost, to tell people, I like to just put a disclaimer when I'm not an expert on something, when I don't know the intricacies. So I am not Kyle Kalinske on this subject. I am not Abby Martin on this subject. I'm not Aaron Mate on this subject. I'm just me. Domestic politics is kind of my wheelhouse. I believe you would say the same thing too. But you and I were talking before this that there's some stuff that we don't hear anyone talking about in relation to the Ukraine and Russia standoff. If you don't know what's going on, the Cliff Notes version, there's a major standoff. The media and the neocons are huffing and puffing that Putin and Russia is about to invade Ukraine. There is military buildup. Russia has reportedly put 100,000 or so troops on the border between Ukraine and Russia. The U.S. is arming everybody and their mother. Ukraine, other post-Soviet Union states around Ukraine. So the U.S. has been arming both Ukraine and other states in a potential buildup. It was announced yesterday, I believe, that the U.S. has a little over 8,000 troops at the ready. So this is pretty bad, if you ask me. Personally, not that I don't care about Ukraine or Russia, but I don't know why the media is hysterical about this, but they don't seem to cover, we're still committing genocide in Yemen and many other places that we should care about. It's not to say you shouldn't care about what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, but what about all the other places and all the other people that are starving or being killed due to U.S. involvement in other countries? But Steve, I wanted to talk to you about this. So remember, smash the like button. I'll just read just a quick part from this article you pointed out to me. U.S. enemies are lining up to test Joe Biden. Joe Biden is confronting a series of distinct but interlocking global crises and hotspots, with U.S. foes lining up to test the mettle of an under-pressure leader and their own sense that the United States is a retreating global power. Biden made the kind of fateful decision on Monday that might be more at home in the tense 1970s, putting up to 8,500 troops on alert. That's what I just mentioned, to rush to Eastern Europe to counter the Kremlin's move to force the U.S. away from its western flank. But his trial of nerves with Russian President Putin, who is holding Ukraine hostage, CNN, in a bid to reverse the West's expansion after the Cold War, is far from his only global headache. And then they go on to talk about, on the other side of the globe, a strategic ballad of military might is playing out as the U.S. and China maneuver armadas and warplanes amid tensions over Taiwan. So, Steve, with it established that essentially you have a standoff between Russia and Ukraine, Russia, I think there's validity, doesn't want NATO further going east towards Russia. Russia, when the Soviet Union broke up, was given assurances by the West that NATO would not further march towards Russia. Like many assurances the U.S. has made, that has not held up. I mean, Turkey basically has missiles pointed at Russia, which, as you remember, U.S. did not take kindly to Cuba having Russian missiles pointed towards us. Not that Putin is a good guy. I'm just trying to be fair here, that Russia does have valid concerns about the West encroachment further into Russia. And I know myself and Tina are going to talk about this probably next week, we're pretty much arming neo-Nazis in Ukraine right now, in addition to whoever else we're arming. But putting aside the specifics of Russia versus Ukraine, you and I were talking before this, that there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that involve other countries kind of looking at the U.S. and possibly thinking, oh, Biden, the U.S., not as big of a superpower anymore, and maybe this is their opportunity to kind of test us.
Yeah, I mean, this is a story. I mean, if you take yourself out of the current situation, you look back in history, the Roman Empire spread too far, too wide, too thick. It just literally eventually dissipated around the edges. And as the very, very charismatic leader that was keeping it all together, the Caesar at the time, died. so did the empire, and it ended up dissolving, and it became a series of warlords and new areas that became illiterate, and so on and so forth. And you see this has also happened throughout history with Alexander the Great, and more currently Napoleon Bonaparte even. Whenever empire stretches itself out too far, whenever it tries to put its tentacles into too many things, eventually it shows its underbelly, it shows its weaknesses. And right now we made a big to do about Russia. We made a lot of it since Hillary Clinton's failed attempt at the presidency. And now all of a sudden, the Democrats are in power, and so they're trying to shift their focus away from Russia and over to China, because they're trying to use this as leverage for the Build Back Better mindset, if you will, looking at the insane, great, awesome infrastructure that's been built up in China, and using that as a new form of Cold War to gin up support domestically for a lot of robust spending. So really, really, once again, using Cold War style rhetoric to try to boost the economy. Well, all the while, we've got the Ukraine situation playing out, and Putin's looking at us and he's saying, the tiger's got his eye off me for a minute. Let me see if I can slip one by him here. And this is not a testament that the U.S. empirical behavior is good. It's horrible. But it's to show that when an empire tries to reach beyond its means, and the rest of the world is starting to take notice of all the cracks in the armor, that it starts poking. And Biden has proven himself to be feckless, both on domestic policy and foreign policy. The failed withdrawal from Afghanistan, the botched withdrawal, is fresh on everyone's minds, fresh on the fact that they know that this administration is caught between two mindsets. One is trying to retreat away from empire, and the other is still at the same time trying to give off the impression that we're all about empire and meddling in foreign affairs. So we haven't got a clear-cut foreign policy right now. We don't have a clear-cut way of viewing what we want from the world. And as a result of that, we are literally being tested by every single person we've ever thumbed our nose at or meddled with. And they're starting to size us up, and they see us ripe for the pickings. I think in particular, the Russia-China dynamic plays out even more so, because both of those players are very instrumental in our discussions with Iran and understanding their nuclear capabilities. But it's also directly tied to Korea, North Korea. And so then add in all these other aspects, with obviously China desperate for us to take our eyes off China for a minute so they can continue what they're doing. I think it's got a real potential to create a lot of problems for us. Right, wrong, or different, indecision.
You said something that I want to drill in more, because you said the U.S. on one end is trying to end being, empire, but on the other end continue. I don't know. Did I miss something that the U.S. is trying to end being a global imperialist and empire? Because he got out of Afghanistan. We still have a whole lot of private contractors there. Blah 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 blah. I, for one, I don't really care. I feel for the Afghanistan people. We have crippling sanctions on them right now that is starving the Afghanistan people. So he got out, but now he's starving the Afghanistan people. I for one, it was going to be messy no matter what if we got out of Afghanistan. But can you kind of explain more that China and these other countries see the U.S. as trying on one end to kind of pull back on empire?
Well, so you look at it with Russia, the U.S. really wants to not be focused on the Ukraine. The U.S. really wants to not be focused on that area at all. They really desperately want to pivot to this whole concept of China being the new bad guy. They really need China to be that boogeyman, and to be able to take on China and Russia at the same time. That's too much for anybody. That just in and of itself is a massive, horrible Cold War. I mean, it was one thing to be at Cold War with Russia back during Reagan and so forth. It's another thing to take on two superpowers at the same time and try and dilute your power and your strength there while simultaneously dealing with North Korea and simultaneously trying to deal with Iran and others. So I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that the US is trying to appease to some degree the internal desires of the nation to get out of these wars, which is why he pulled out of Afghanistan, even though, to your point, those private contractors are still there and they still have sanctions crippling them, which is an act of war, in my opinion, as well. But it's not the same thing as the incursions. I mean, you look, 8,500 troops are at that European line there by the Ukraine. 8,500. It's not a lot of troops, but it's enough when you're dealing with an incursion into that area. That's not what we want to spend our time on. You know, I mean, that's not where Biden's trying to, he really desperately wants to pivot to China because all of his domestic spending for infrastructure is highly dependent on being able to put the focus on China's efforts. With all the things that they're doing there, and literally without being able to make that the crystallized focus of his domestic agenda to build back better in this, he's got nothing. So everyone's looking at him and realizing he's got his hand in too many cookie jars right now. There's too many things going on, and they recognize that if he turns his head to the left, that they can do something to the right. And that's what you're seeing now. All these different enemies that we've set up realize that we're stretched too thin, that we can't be all things to all people, and that we can't have the kind of focus to deliver the kind of efforts that Biden's trying to do in the US. And they know exactly what he's doing. This is not like they're not dumb. They all know that Biden's using them as a pivot to try to get domestic policy approved. So it's kind of a triangulation by using foreign, geopolitical arrangements to gin up support like we did in World War II when you had all the factories going at the same time. So in one way, there's some nobility in terms of trying to get the domestic economy booming again, to rebuild the infrastructure, to do all these things that would have made him like an FDR. If you remember old Bernie saying Biden's going to be like a new FDR. But this foreign policy blunder, if you will, and I don't know if you call it a blunder so much as a complete and utter miscalculation of how many fires are out there to be put out. And so
Yeah.
I think he's also underestimating the hard-nosed, hardline stances that a lot of these countries are taking that are, quite frankly, tired of the US having a say-so in.